All right, we have a very special guest here today. Now, he's that much of a special guest. I've got a formal introduction here. We have Dr. Rikk Watts online today, a biblical New Testament scholar, also known for his work in the Gospel of Mark, Isaiah, John. He has served as a professor of New Testament of Regent College from 1996 to 2016, and later as Dean of Theology in Alpha Crucis College in Australia. He has a diverse background in aeronautical engineering, philosophy, and theology, and brings a unique perspective to biblical studies and applying it to everyday life. Thank you so much for coming on board here today, Dr. Watts.
Well, Rick will do. I just hope I can live up to that glorious introduction.
Well, to be fair, ChatGPT helped me with the introduction as well. Okay, I think they
Right.
pinched a lot of this actually because I checked on Regent College. It just what it does. It's just
Okay.
amalgamates all the research online. But every line of it is true, and I'm very thankful for you to come on board today because we have a great opportunity to have an expert in Mark comment and put his voice in the arena for what's going on with regards to a somewhat of an online debate between inspiring philosophy and Dr. Dan McClellan with regards to the deity claims in Mark 2 specifically, but just generally in the Gospel of Mark. So we're very, very excited. So I thought before we get into it, I would just love to, into this video, I'd love to get the opportunity to ask you
Okay.
just a little bit about what you're doing nowadays
Right. Yeah.
and a little bit into the inside of yourself as well. That'd be great.
Great. Well, as of today, well, actually before that, I'm retired. Have been retired for the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years. 73 this year. So I'm delighted not to be working 60 hours a week, which was the usual when working as an academic in an institution. We're living in Canada, which we love. Really enjoy Vancouver. And right now we're in Australia visiting family and friends. That's kind of a brief overview. Hopefully that will do. Is there any more you'd like to know? Feel free.
No, no, that's fine. That's lovely. Yeah. We were just having a chat before and you were giving me a
Mhm.
lot of insight into Mark, and we thought possibly we could split this over a couple episodes.
Sure.
But essentially, we just want to analyze the claims. And so, what I'll do is I'll share my screen
Okay.
with this video. Have you got that video in front of you there?
I can see it. Yes.
Lovely, lovely. So it should come for both of us. And so I thought we could just go step by step, analyzing the claims and the rebuttals from Dr. McClellan with
Yep.
regards to the response here with inspiring philosophy. So you ready to go?
If you wish. Yep.
Lovely, lovely. I'll press play and let me know if there's any issues with audio.
So let's be clear. Jesus does not explicitly say to the Pharisees, you are wrong. That's an interpretation of his words.
Yes, obviously, I'm characterizing his response, but the fact that he says, so that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, very explicitly indicates there is information they do not have, and Jesus is going to provide that information through this demonstration of his power by healing this paralyzed man. So while he does not explicitly say, you are wrong, he is very clearly telling them that they are wrong, and you are going to acknowledge that very fact later in this video, where you try to suggest he's telling them they're wrong in another way. In fact, let's look at what you insist Jesus is saying they're wrong about.
It seems far more likely that what Jesus is saying is that the Pharisees
I might just pause it there. In
Mhm.
case you want me to stop or pause or comment
Yep.
on anything,
Yep.
I'm happy to do that.
Right. Okay.
Um,
Yeah, at some point early on, I'd just like to maybe say some things about the overall approach they take. Uh,
yeah, should we start? Should we start with that now?
uh, yes, I think we probably should, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Good. So, obviously, I've parachuted into the middle of an ongoing conversation, and that's always tricky. One wants to be fair to both sides of the discussion. It's one of the reasons why, when you're training people academically in biblical studies, certainly in my tradition, they have to do a history of research. They need to know what the conversation's on about before they jump in. So I think, given that this is a conversation that's already happening, it probably would be helpful to people to get some idea of how the whole narrative unfolds, because it doesn't actually start with Jesus saying, but so that you will know. Right? And I think if you start there, it can give a bit of a misleading impression. So why don't I just quickly go through what's really happening at this point
In
in this
Mark 2.
particular
Would you like me to
story?
bring
So,
up Mark 2 at all?
Yep, we're going to get to Mark 2, right? So you've had the prologue of Mark, probably runs through to verse 13. Jesus is pretty passive in all of that. The one who's most present, interestingly, is God. As I think Nere's pointed out, it's God who speaks through the prophets, Isaiah, and I would argue Malachi. It's God who speaks through John the Baptist. It's God's Spirit who descends on Jesus at the baptism. He's the one who tears open the heavens. It's God who speaks from heaven, and it's his Spirit who drives Jesus into the wilderness. And so it's pretty much the focus in that first section is really on God setting this whole thing up. Then what happens after this almost enigmatic story about the temptation, where you're not really sure of the outcome except that angels come and minister to him, but you get very little information. The next thing you get is Jesus in the public arena. So you've moved from a private sphere where Jesus is mostly passive to where he's now active. And what's intriguing there is it's almost as if the emphasis totally flips. Now Jesus is the one who's active all the way through, and there's very little reference to God doing stuff. Far more about Jesus, which is interesting because Mark's opening begins to talk about the fact that this is what Isaiah prophesied. And in those two texts, Isaiah and Malachi, and again, I know Dan takes a different view here, but we can come to that later. The primary agent in both of those texts happens to be Yahweh himself. The Messiah gets very little mention in Isaiah. The word only occurs with regard to Cyrus. It's mostly, especially in chapters 40 through 55, about the coming of Yahweh himself, picking up on Israel's Exodus experience. And Malachi is again really about the coming of the Lord. There's no mention of a son or really any mediatory figure. It's just as someone who prepares for the coming of Yahweh. So that's interesting when you get that after from verse 14 and following to find that all the action is focused on Jesus. And the direct implication from that is, well, if you want to talk about Yahweh being active, you have a look at what Jesus does and what he says. So you get a series.
Yeah, it seems to be quite interesting where Mark is not necessarily being subtle, that where Yahweh is moving, Jesus is moving, that the one preparing the way for the Lord is John the Baptist, and John the Baptist announces Jesus. So look, I mean, it's again, I guess it comes down to this question of agency and how one interprets it. But
Well,
it seems Mark has a high Christology.
Yeah. Oh well, just to respond to that. Well, let's finish the context if we can, then we'll come back to the high Christology bit. So after chapter 14, Jesus announces the gospel, and I would argue a lot of that language of that initial proclamation draws particularly again on Isaiah 40 through 55. But there's no surprise to that if I can step back a bit. In terms of context, which really matters to Dan, based on other scholars' reconstructions of what was going on in the synagogue, it appears, notice that it's a reconstruction, that they were using a 3-year cycle, in which case they'd read through all of Torah, and then alongside that they'd have the Haftarah, which are readings from the prophets. Now, what's interesting is you would know for them the prophets go from Joshua through to 2 Kings, right? And then you get the major prophets beginning with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12. So now that's a massive body of material. What's intriguing in these reconstructions is when they read the prophets in the context of just having read Torah, 2/3 of those readings come from Isaiah. And just try to visualize that. Right? Here's this vast extent of prophetic writings, and 2/3 of them that accompany the Torah readings over those 3 years come from just this single book. And what's interesting, 2/3 of those 2/3 are from Isaiah 40 to 66. Now, that's just staggering, right? What it tells me is that if this reconstruction is correct, when Jewish people read the Torah in Jesus' day and were thinking about what that meant for their future, they went to Isaiah.
Wow.
Now, it seems to me, if that's the case, and given how Mark starts, when people start talking about Jesus' identity, and they manage to do that without mentioning Isaiah once, we have a problem. Okay, you want to talk about cultural awareness and context, that seems to be a big issue. No surprise then that there are so many citations of and allusions to Isaiah running through the New Testament. Far and away the most common prophetic book, only exceeded by the Psalms, but the Psalms is not a single work, it's a larger collection. You could say the same with Qumran, massive emphasis on Isaiah. So it's no surprise that the New Testament is picking up on Isaiah. And then when you see Mark starting with Isaiah 40, that has got to tell you something about how you understand Jesus. So it's no surprise to me that when you read Mark, what you're expecting is the coming of Yahweh, his personal presence. That's the enormous emphasis in 43:55. It's rarely noted. And partly because I can say most New Testament scholars, we have to make a choice very early on in our training. You have to learn Greek or Hebrew, and then you have to focus on one or the other. That's highly problematic because you get New Testament scholars who really are not at home in Israel's scriptures. And then, they hear a text and they think, oh, yeah, that's just one among many. But when they hear about Isaiah, they're not thinking, oh, my goodness, chapter 40 introduces this section in the prophets that is unparalleled anywhere else in the prophets, with this tremendous emphasis on Yahweh's personal presence. But if you're aware of that, and then you read Mark's citation of Isaiah 40, you know what you're waiting for.
So how, just very quickly, how would that, I mean, I know there's a textual variant in the first line about the Son of God in Mark 1:1, but the Messiah is quite clear, and then he does that Mark and sandwich with the Isaiah and Malachi scriptures. How does that commensurate with messianic understanding in the first century? The influence of Isaiah there, I get that, but he's announced Jesus as the Messiah, the good news. Seems like a little bit of a polemic towards Rome, as opposed to the Evangelion a little bit, but with regards to Augustus. But
maybe not. But anyway,
maybe not. But with regards to the Messiah and putting those scriptures together, how does that work?
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. When you think about Jewish expectations around the Messiah, back in the probably early 60s, there was this sense that it was a lot more fragmented than what people thought, that scholarship had created this construction called messianic hope, and that it didn't really fit the kind of fragmentary, illusory, not illusory, but illusory, with the A, illusions, right? Understanding of the Messiah in intertestamental literature. But as folks reflected on that, they began to realize, well, illusions are really for insiders, and they presuppose a body of knowledge. The citation is usually putting something quite plain out in front of people to argue a case. Right? But an illusion is not doing that. It's what ties insiders together, because you recognize illusions. So as they thought about that, they realized actually these illusions do paint a fairly consistent picture of the Messiah as essentially a military political figure whose job was to purge Jerusalem and drive out Israel's opponents, but he himself isn't the deliverer. He's used by God, but if you read the intertestamental literature, but even pseudepigraphical, the emphasis really lies on it's Yahweh who does this, not primarily the Messiah. It's Yahweh who's empowering it all. But of course, that's exactly what you'd expect if you've read the Exodus. No one thinks this is Moses' gig. Right? No one thinks that, right? This is all about who Yahweh is. And of course, if you know Exodus, part of that is the revelation of what it means for God to be Yahweh, which Abraham had not seen, but which they experienced at the Exodus. And what does it mean to experience Yahweh? Well, they see his enormous authority in terms of words and deeds. Right? And that's about his very presence. Now, you think about that. That's at the very heart of Jewish identity. What goes on in the Gospels, if not exactly that? You're hoping for a new Exodus. What lies at the heart of the Exodus? It's got to be identity. So Dan is right that the presenting issue in chapter 2 of Mark is authority, but you can't simply, because of that, rule out identity. The scribes don't do that, and Jesus doesn't do that. The Exodus doesn't do that. You can't separate those two things. You might emphasize authority, and you might decide to leave aside the identity question, which is what Jesus does. Later on, when the demons want to identify him, he shuts them up. When the disciples, Peter finally confesses, you're the Messiah, Jesus shuts them up. When they come down from Transfiguration, he says, don't tell anybody. So he's clearly not afraid of demonstrating his power, but he's very careful about managing statements about his identity. Right? Now, I don't think you can separate those in the way that Dan seems to be, and the scribes certainly don't, because their response to Jesus is, hang on a minute, only God. So they immediately go to identity based on the deed,
Yes.
right? So
I
that
think that's a big
combination of
part of
word
that
and
mark
deed,
too.
we're not surprised by that. That's just at the very heart of Israel's Exodus foundation, okay?
Okay,
Right,
lovely.
so,
I mean, we've got a lot of context there.
yeah, we'll see. But, if you don't have that in mind, when you come to Isaiah 40 in Mark, you're going to think, oh, he's just citing a text. Well, actually, no, he's not just citing a text. This is like 7 years ago with, Lincoln's address at Gettysburg. It's not about Gettysburg. It's about the significance of what it means to be American. But if you don't live in that American cultural milieu, you'll miss the importance of texts like Isaiah 40. We tend to flatten it out if we're New Testament scholars and we don't really appreciate what's going on in Israel's scriptures. Okay, so I would say at the very beginning, the total emphasis is not on a mediator figure. It's on Yahweh. Now, this brings us to your question, what about the Messiah? Well, Jewish people do have messianic expectations, right? And they're not just fragmentary. They do have this picture of this messianic figure. But the question is that the one that Jesus shares? So it's intriguing, and I'm surprised that Dan doesn't mention this, but, I'm not going to, he's got a limited amount of time and he's trying to do with Mark too. So, okay. On the other hand, he does talk about context. So, well, maybe he should have mentioned this. The only time Jesus really does pick up on his identity publicly is in Jerusalem. The climax of Mark. It's Passover, Jerusalem, city of the great king, temple, Yahweh's dwelling place. It's enormous. His opponents come after him. He's already had that entry, right? Kind of an triumphal entry, as a colleague of mine would call it. Doesn't look like a typical entry. Then he performs this action in the temple, which gets everyone's attention. They come after him and he silences them all. And then he says, and now I have a question for you. Now, this often gets missed, but this is an incredible moment. I just think of the dramatics of it. They've come at him publicly, trying to take him down. He's taken them apart, shown them to be hypocritical, very poor readers of scripture, and with an agenda that's not about pleasing God at all, but really other motivations. So he does that publicly. When they're silent, he says, now I have a question for you. Now think about it. What question could he have asked? He's demonstrated this
I'm
extraordinary...
waiting in suspense.
Right? Yeah. Well, what's his question? Well, it's about the Messiah. How can the scribes call the Messiah David's son when David himself calls him Lord? Now, I'm fully aware of all the Psalm 110 stuff. It's one of the most difficult psalms in the Psalter, and we can talk about that later. But that bare fact tells you that Jesus is rewriting the common expectation of what it means to be the Messiah. And he grounds that not in being David's son, but he grounds his understanding, which I would argue is the scriptural one from his point of view, in what it means to be David's Lord.
Oof.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, two things
Yep.
out of this just very quickly. People will point out...
Just real quick, I love Matthew's account of this as well, when he just says the scribes just silenced. They just they have not, they were too scared to say anything because what were the implications?
Right. I mean, isn't that the truth? You think you're going to use a colloquialism, come the bounce with Jesus? Just be really careful, right? I wouldn't want to risk doing that. So two things come out of that. One is people point out, well, it's true that in the Greek text of Psalm 110, it's Kyrios, right? And, Kyrios can have a range of meanings, but it's clear in this one, it's probably more to do with Yahweh. The underlying Hebrew is Adon, not Yahweh, they say. But here's the interesting thing. I think in something like 87% of the uses, like 87%, it's a bit of approximately 87%, excuse me, that just sounds bizarre. 87% of those references in the Psalms, references where they use the word Adon, they actually refer to Yahweh, 87%. And in the traditionally Davidic Psalms, I'm just saying traditionally, right, every other use of Adon, that is 37 times, refers to Yahweh. This reference in Psalm 110 is the only one about which there might be some question. And I think Jesus is playing on that. There's
Yes.
some
Okay.
stuff going on in Psalm 110 that does not fit neatly into a purely human king. It's a really tricky psalm. Right?
And
then,
this is, I guess, speaks to this idea as well, that when we take as the total corpus of Mark, when we isolate, just Mark 2, it's hard to get that wider context of what Mark is speaking into, and just having this understanding of Mark as a general picture of who his depiction of Jesus, and it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to show that the implication of Jesus' words are far more significant than potentially what's being represented in the video.
so I want to affirm, with Dan, you've got to pay attention to the text, the data, right? You do have to read through the paragraph, look at the Greek, work it all. You've got to do that, right? The parts really matter, but the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think that gets lost. Right? When you do this kind of fragmentary thing, if you're not careful, you're basically implying that Jesus is a grab bag of different psychological tensions. But that is not the impression you get from reading the Gospels. I don't get that impression. Whether you're reading
No, not at all.
Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or whether you're reading John, you get the sense of this incredibly coherent, otherworldly, human, yes, but higher being for sure. You get this consistent figure. And so I think if I can just add to that, Dan, the larger problem underneath that, and this is another podcast, is the Jews are not interested in theology. That's a Platonic creation. That's what they're after. The Jews are interested in history. Right? Now, people might debate whether this stuff is, it's historical veracity, but all the emphasis is on seeing and hearing. It is in the Exodus. Jewish scholars pointed that out, the number of references to seeing and hearing. It's not theological speculation, it's what they've seen. Right? And the same thing in 1 John, what we've seen and touched and heard and handled. That's why the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies and not works of theology or philosophy. Now, because they're
Wow.
biographies, the
That
focus
there.
is on the integrity of the person, and that gets lost if you just split Mark up into little episodes.
I guess that would obviously, explain so much as to why the authors don't announce themselves either. It wasn't necessarily a normal thing to do within that first century context as well. The way
Why would they
they're meant
anyway?
to be historical.
Why would they want to mention, what have they got to do with it? It's not about them. These guys are just totally besotted with Jesus. That's all they really care about.
Yeah.
I mean, okay,
Yeah.
so we're trying to prove how great we are by talking about the books we published and our bibliographies, but that doesn't mean the guys who follow Jesus are playing that game. That's our problem. That's not theirs. Right? They want to
That's a
focus
truly
on
fascinating topic about the idea that it's more it's more about history than it is about theology.
Oh, yeah.
And that would obviously, even the way that humanity works in that sense today, it's quite interesting how combative we are about historical events. I mean, just geopolitically speaking, in the last 10 years, if we've seen how people fight over their interpretation of history, that's interesting. That's really interesting concept.
It's a whole
I'd love
other
to.
podcast,
Well,
if I can be presumptive.
it is, and I think we should continue with the video and the claims that he's making. But that's
Can
a
I just get back to
fascinating
the
insight.
context again? Sorry, just to quickly do that.
Sure.
Okay. So then in chapter 2, we meet a series of conflicts. But the way this story begins is Jesus has been teaching. He's in the house. There's a huge crowd around him. Some people come to him. They rip open the roof. They lower this man down. And then you get Jesus' motivation. And his motivation in healing a man is not to make a statement about his identity per se to the watching scribes, who aren't even mentioned at this point. What's going on is he responds to their faith.
The guy's
Now that's interesting.
dropping the guy down.
When do you ever seen somebody in Israel's history that's about responding to people's faith? That's more the question I think that should be asked here. If you want to know how Jesus sees himself, start with that one. He's the one who responds to faith and does things that other humans can't do. Who does that kind of thing? Right? It might be worth just reflecting on that for a bit, right? Before we just kind of, leap onto this other debate.
That's super fascinating. Okay, because I've always looked at that part in that scripture as I thought it was just in terms of application, somewhat of pastoral application of the idea of what your faith can enable someone else to have an encounter with Christ. And because of the faith of the people that lowered down the man, he ended up having his encounter with Christ. And I've looked at it, I thought that's beautiful. It's so exhortative. I love that. And I think it's so beautiful in many ways. But in what you've just posed there, the idea of Jesus himself responding to their faith, it seems that that's a very Yahweh-esque, the idea of that's what God sees your faith, right?
Well, and I just, this is a whole nother debate again, but I think it's now generally recognized that the Gospels, their closest analogy are Greco-Roman historical biographies. They're not exactly that, but that's their closest parallel. And if you think about it, that would make sense. The language they're writing in is not elite language, it's koine, it's the language of the common people. It's exactly, Jesus too spoke to the common people. If you're going to speak to the common people, you've got to use something they can recognize and understand. You can't go inventing some entirely new genre. I don't think that makes sense. So it does make sense that they decide to write about an historical biography. And the focus of that is on the person of Jesus. Well, the implication of that is, for me, is don't put the Gospels in your religion section. Don't put them in your theology section. Don't put them in your devotional section or your pastoral guidance section. They belong alongside the lives of Caesar, the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, the life of Stalin, the life of Churchill, the life of Alexander the Great, and you now make your choice which of these great ones you're going to follow. That's what the Gospels are on about. That's what their genre tells us. And I think we've missed that by turning them into a bunch of other things. So it's no surprise that what we see is Jesus' response to their faith is telling us something about him. It's not primarily about us.
Well, would you think it speaks to the identity at all?
Well, sure, because Jesus is an agent. Right? So this, if you go back to the history thing, history is not about events. History is about actions, I would argue. Well, I'm picking up on Collingwood here. And people's actions are all about their intention and their identity. So the question is not whether Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but why did he cross the Rubicon? What motivated him to do that? And for me, that's the big question behind the Gospels, right? They're Greco-Roman biographies, and you have to keep asking yourself, who did this guy think he is? Which is the question that keeps getting asked in Mark, right? Well, who I am is about identity, and you can't separate identity from what you say and what you do. Right? It's just utterly integrated.
Okay, I love that. Well, shall we continue?
Yeah, and so anyway, then you get the sins are forgiven. All right, and then the bit that I think Dan misses is the scribe's immediate response to that is, "This is blasphemy." That's their immediate response. So what Jesus is really responding to is the charge of blasphemy, right? And that got missed, I think, in Dan's presentation. But let's go on through the video if you want to.
Yes. Okay. All right. Is it coming up? Yep. All right.
These have misunderstood who the Son of Man is. He is just as divine as the Ancient of Days, and that is why he has the ability to forgive sins.
So I am glad that we are in agreement that Jesus is telling his accusers that they're wrong, not explicitly, obviously, but we both interpret his response as the correction of an error on their part. And our disagreement is on the nature of that error. And it sounds to me, based on these comments, that you're suggesting their error is that they don't know that the Son of Man is God. And therefore, Jesus' response is correcting that error by identifying the Son of Man as God. If that is your argument, and if I'm wrong about this, I'm happy to be corrected, but if that is your argument, it is completely and utterly incoherent and implausible for multiple reasons. To begin, they never bring up the Son of Man, much less the relationship of the Son of Man to God. The first time the phrase Son of Man occurs anywhere in the Gospel of Mark is in Jesus' response in Mark 2:10, when he introduces the figure of the Son of Man. So their error can have nothing to do with the Son of Man. They have never brought it up. So their error is not that they don't know the Son of Man is God. Jesus is introducing the Son of Man as the answer to their rhetorical question that they're asking in their hearts. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now that's a rhetorical question they're asking in their hearts because they think that only God can forgive sins. Jesus tells them so that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So what they don't know is that the Son of Man has that authority. Now, 1,000 times out of 1,000 times, if somebody asks the rhetorical question, who can do X apart from agent Y? And somebody responds, well, agent Z. That is going to be interpreted as the identification of the agent apart from agent Y who can do X. You would have to be explicit about the identification of agent Z as agent Y. If that response were intended to correct a misunderstanding about the relationship of agent Y to agent Z, that response would need to be explicit about it. You would need to say, well, agent Z, and don't you remember that agent Z is agent Y? If that is what is intended, and you are not explicit about it, then you must be relying on the people asking the rhetorical question already believing that agent Y is agent Z, in which case your response only needs to remind them of agent Z, whom they already believe to be agent Y. So for Jesus' response to do what you're saying it does without being explicit about it would require that they already believe the Son of Man is God. But you've said that they don't believe that, which would mean Jesus would need to be explicit in his response. Because again, 1,000 times out of 1,000 times, somebody asks who can do X apart from agent Y, and you say agent Z, that means agent Z is the agent apart from agent Y who can do X. So Jesus' response would need to be explicit if he were trying to address the relationship of the Son of Man to God, unless he already knew that his accusers believed the Son of Man was God. But we know that can't be what they believe, because if they believed that the Son of Man was already God, then they would already know the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, because the Son of Man would be God. But what is it that they don't know that Jesus is demonstrating to them? So that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So if they don't think that the Son of Man is God, Jesus' response cannot plausibly be correcting that. If they already believe that the Son of Man is God, then Jesus' response is not addressing that. There is no plausible way to render Jesus' response an identification of the Son of Man as God in light of what is actually written in Mark chapter 2. Your argument is utterly incoherent and utterly implausible.
Okay.
Your thoughts, good sir. There was a lot there to digest, and I'm thinking Mark Y and Z and Agent X, but essentially, from what I gather, what Mark's saying there is that he would have been explicit. I think he states that it explicitly differentiates the Son of Man from Yahweh, therefore he can't be Yahweh. And I think essentially that's the argument, that he's been given authority.
I think it's just it's really important to try and let the text set the agenda here. So, as I mentioned before, we showed that clip. The question, what's at issue is this is blasphemy. Right? That's the issue. And the reason they give the reason why they think it's blasphemy, because only God can do this. Now, it's worth noticing that response for some things that Dan's going to say a bit later. Why do the scribes think that only God can do this? Well, there are two, really key texts, and I've written on this in that commentary on the New Testament, use of the Old Testament by Beale and Carson. I look at this passage. The two really big texts are Exodus 34, which is around the golden calf, huge, massive text in the book of Exodus, and then Isaiah 43. And in both of those texts, forgiving sins seems to be a part of Yahweh's unique identity. And, Dan's talked about being aware of the broader cultural context. Well, it seems to be a thoroughgoing Jewish tradition that Yahweh alone forgives sins. Sirach, Midrash on the Psalms, various documents in Qumran, etc., etc. And then other Markan scholars, some of whom later on Dan will actually quote in another context, themselves observe the Shema-like phrasing of the scribes' language. It does sound like, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," which heightens the exclusivity of it. So the point is, they're saying there really is only one who can forgive sins. That's why you're speaking blasphemy, because you can't do that. Only God can do this. Right. Now, that's not really about identity at this point, though, of course, they are connecting the action and the statement with who can appropriately say that. And for them, that's only God. Right? Now, do notice that there are no exception clauses. Gaze of Amesh once suggested, well, the priest in the temple can forgive sins, but that's not mentioned here. The scribes don't mention that. Dan himself will later talk about various speculations concerning mediatorial figures. The scribes know nothing of such figures. Right? And if they do, they apparently reject their claims. Either way, they're not mentioned. The only one in their mind who can say this kind of thing is Yahweh, right? Now, all Jesus is after at this point is demonstrating that he has the authority. He does not go after identity. We've already mentioned that earlier. It seems pretty clear as you read through Mark that Jesus holds off on the identity question while not being afraid to demonstrate his authority. So it's like his authority is preparing the ground, and that might be shocking enough. The identity stuff, they're not really ready to start going there until the very last question he asks publicly toward the end of the gospel, where he says, think about the Messiah not in terms of David, but in terms of David's Adon, which elsewhere in David's Psalms means Yahweh.
And just
So,
on that point,
yeah.
it seems that from what I'm, my layman understanding of Mark, the Son of Man, Ben Adam, human being, this figure is that Jesus is referencing to, seems to culminate in firstly in this scene with the scribes towards the end of the temple, with regards to there might be a divine quality to the Messiah that they never first considered, and then it seems to be a climactic ending that the Son of Man that he keeps referring to in front of Caiaphas in Mark 14 is the one from Daniel 7, and so there's this it seems to be a revealing. And when we look back into those original scriptures, the Lord of the Sabbath, the authority to forgive sins, it seems that there's more than just the human being title of Ben Adam. There seems to be a divine quality, which gets revealed later on. And it might not be, if we isolate Mark 2, all that revealing in this moment, but even the things that you're saying now alone, with response to the charge from the scribes, from the response to the faith, there seems to be something more. It seems to be that it almost seems like an Easter egg of sorts. There's something more about this Son of Man figure.
Well, and I think this is a really important point. And Dan is right. This is the first time the word Son of Man appears. There's another one in reference to the Lord of the Sabbath, but it doesn't really come up again until Jesus starts talking about his suffering. So this is the first of only two references in the front half of Mark. Well, Son of Man in Jesus, several small libraries have been written on this topic. And I think one Oxford Don once said, Son of Man, that way lies madness. It's an incredibly complex discussion. But I think what's striking here is when Jesus uses Son of Man in these two texts, Mark 2 and then a bit later when he's talking about being Lord of the Sabbath, look at people's response. So many scholars will note it's an unusual phrasing, though Charlie Moule, famous Cambridge scholar, pointed out, but the phrasing no more unusual than Son of God, right? The same kind of grammatical structure. Why is it so unusual? Well, there you go. But no one seems to respond as though, gee, that's a weird way of saying it. You don't get any sense of a quizzical what, nor do you get recognition. No one says, oh, you're that Son of Man. So I think Larry Hurtado is right at this point that Son of Man actually is a placeholder chosen specifically because it doesn't have any content. Right? Why would Jesus do that? Well, we know that he doesn't want to have Messiah running around the place because of what people will do with it. He's very careful about controlling questions as to his identity. So it seems to me that this is one of those moments when it's the first moment in Mark when Jesus uses this placeholder that elicits no reaction, either of puzzlement or recognition, and he fills it with content. It's the content that actually is the issue. Authority to forgive sins. Right? Now, that's not really identity yet, because the Son of Man, I think, is the deliberate avoidance of identity language. He's going to come to that later on.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that by the time you get toward the end of Mark, you start to see some of the Son of Man language having, clouds of heaven, judgment connotations. All right, that begins to point you more clearly to Daniel 7. But I don't think you can argue that there's Daniel 7 in view, not least for the fact that Jesus is using this as some kind of semi-title, and it's not a title in Daniel. So I think I would want to say to guys, don't rush to Daniel 7 too quickly. That's not really on the table here. Not in terms of Mark's account itself. It does appear later on, but that's not really the issue right now.
Do you think, just briefly off topic, do you think it towards the end of the chapter, there's probably more explicit references to it? But is this just like a part of this secret Messiah motif that there's a revealing happens, like Mark is placing these little references that we soon will find out later on as a part of a storytelling or as part of a literary device? Or
in fact, I'd go more than that. If I can just preface this by saying, you mentioned storytelling. Some decades ago, there was a famous book, Mark as Story. And basically the point of that was to say you've got to pay attention to the literary structure of Mark. They're not just, to phrase a German scholar, pearls on a string, as Mona Hooker responded. Actually, any woman knows that pearls are not just thrown together. They're very
Mm.
carefully weighed. And so, it's basically arguing that Mark's very careful in what he does. And what this book was trying to argue is, well, you need to pay attention to the narrative. Part of some of the critiques of that book was when they talk about that model of narrative, they're often using modern conceptions of the novel, which Mark ain't. I don't, they're at least making the point that there's a story quality here. But actually, I wouldn't use story. I'd say this is Mark's historical biography. He's reporting on what Jesus said and did. So for him, this is history. It's not just a story. It's not like Jesus, if I can use this language, is a Christian version of, Lord of the Rings, and Jesus is some uber-Jewish Gandalf, which, if I can say, I think is what many Christians actually think when they read the Gospels. Kind of stories that are truish, but they don't stick them alongside the life of Napoleon or Caesar because they don't really see them as historical biographies.
I find it difficult in just something, without digressing too much. I find it difficult how people don't even consider that for Luke sometimes. I mean, Luke is quite evident from the outset of what his intentions are. And maybe it's a little bit more subtle in Mark and Matthew, but simultaneously it's quite evident that there's many historical events that he's listing that is cross-referenced with the other gospel and the other synoptics. So there's definitely a drawing on some type of tradition. And in another episode, I would love to talk to you about some of Mark's source material and Q and all that nonsense. But another time, there's so much to get through.
There is. Well, that's why people spend their lives doing this stuff. And it's why Jesus changed the world, which I think is undeniable.
Oh, he did.
So
without
we shouldn't be surprised it's going to take a few or more than a few. Let's come back to that Son of Man stuff. I think to go after Daniel 7 is a bit of a red herring at this point.
Understood.
Okay. And I think the second thing is Jesus is deliberately not answering or pursuing the identity question. Not that doesn't mean it's not there.
Yes.
And I think that's, I want to say to whoever Dan's interlocutor was, no, I think Dan has a point here. This is not primarily about identity, but I want to say to Dan, that doesn't mean it's not about identity.
Exactly. And that's a huge point.
Things are connected, right?
You can't, it's almost as if he's accusing Michael from inferring and drawing from the text unnecessarily, while he's simultaneously doing the same thing. When the fact is that the lack of inference doesn't mean there is none.
I think it's more nuanced than what either of them are. That's okay.
I like that. That's good. Well, shall we continue with the next part?
Yep, by all means. Anyway, all of that to say, when I hear statements that are so absolute, like this is completely and unutterably wrong and all the rest of it, that's
it's interesting.
That's not going to fly in an academic setting. That's just, I think, come on.
Well, I'm grateful for you to say that you're saying that, especially with your academic history, because Dr. McClellan constantly appeals to the consensus and overwhelmingly representing the consensus on particular matters, and he does speak with such authority based on that. His own appeal to authority in that field, and they are absolute statements. He says it's absolutely incoherent, nonsensical that the guy's made the claim. So it's very intriguing to hear you say that, which would carry some weight.
And there are good reasons to reject that interpretation.
So there are not good reasons to reject this interpretation. There are only dogmatic reasons, and the entire rest of this video entirely ignores my arguments, because the rest of this video is basically saying Jesus must be claiming to be God because Jesus is doing things that, according to the Hebrew Bible, only God was supposed to be able to do. And my argument is that Jesus, by analogy with the Son of Man, by analogy with the angel of the Lord, is authorized to do the things that only God was supposed to be able to do. That's why Jesus is asserting that.
Yep.
Okay, so the bit that I would really like to hear explored a bit more is the link between words, action, and identity. That's happening so quickly, and it's all just compressed. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute. Think as a Jew, your foundational moment is the Exodus, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Genesis is simply setting you up for the Exodus and the revelation of who Yahweh is. And how does that happen in the book of Exodus? It's through what people see and hear. It's words and deeds. Right? Now, the interesting language here is that Jesus is claiming to be God. Well, if you do take the view that Mark is propounding, Mark, Dan's interlocutor, why would you even need to make that claim? Where does Yahweh ever claim that he's God? He just says and does, you know. Israel, they have the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, right? They've got that. But just that language of Jesus claiming to be God, that's not, if he really is God, he's not claiming anything. He's just doing what God does. It's not as if Jesus is reading a playbook
Okay.
that says on this particular day, let me finish this if I can.
Yeah.
Right? Some guy's going to be lowered through the ceiling, and on this day, you need to do something that shows people that you're God. Is that really what Jesus is thinking? You think when he's in the boat and that storm comes and they wake him up, he opens up his little iPad and says, oh, today I have to show that I'm God, right? Seriously? No, the question is, who's going to stand up after being asleep and say, shut up, with the expectation that it will? That's more the question. That's the question of agency. That's what history is about. Agency, events, not events, agency and intention. And I think that's getting missed in all of this, right? It's for both of them. He's not making claims. He's doing. This is who he is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that what you just said there, the fact that whether or not it's necessary to make the claim based on the action itself, because when he even responds in Mark 2 to what's harder, essentially, to forgive sins or get up and walk? Well, it's easy to say anyone's sins are forgiven. How are you ever going to know? It's very difficult to make a paralyzed man walk. So he's making an argument from essentially what is harder. So I'll do the miracle and that will speak for itself, won't it?
I would take the view that Jesus says neither. They're both.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because what they're picking up Jesus up on is, how can you possibly say this? And now this gets missed too. And I'm surprised now to learn that, Dan has actually done some linguistics. Well, what about Austin's performative language? So words don't just describe, words actually do things. And if you think about that, when Jesus says your sins are forgiven, that's performative. That's not descriptive, right? That's agency language, okay? So that seems to get missed in this discussion. Who is the one who can do this? Right? So agency is embodied underneath that action, which would make sense if you're not thinking about claims, but you're just simply doing who you are. You're simply reflecting, this is who I am. Does that make some sense to you?
It does. It does. I'm going to have to, there's so many things I'm going to have to table because we could just continue to digress. When you said neither,
okay, sorry about
I definitely have to,
Okay.
I'm putting that on the list. But perfect sense. We will continue.
Talks about this. I'm presenting at a conference in June that talks about this, how Jesus is the authorized bearer of the divine name, and so can do the things that only God is supposed to be able to do. So when I say Jesus forgives sins because Jesus is asserting identification as the Son of Man who is authorized to do the things only God is supposed to be able to do, and you say, no, Jesus is identifying as God because Jesus is claiming to do the things that only God is supposed to be able to do, you're entirely ignoring my argument.
Because there's actually two other indicators in this passage that Jesus is claiming to be God. Notice what Jesus says in verse 8.
Before we get on to that, can I just... I'm just interested where this language, the authorized bearer of God's name, comes from, that Dan has just introduced. I don't see that anywhere in Mark. That's obviously come from somewhere else. And it presupposes that you'd be reading Jesus in the light of some other lens, which I think later on is going to show to be the angel of Yahweh. Right? Well, if that's what's going on, it seems pretty odd to me that in the New Testament writings that reflect the period after the Gospels, right? So they pretty much drop Son of Man, and what you get is Jesus, Son, Messiah, Lord. And should I point out here, or I should point out, about 17 times, depending on what you see as pulling material or not, Paul sees Jesus as Son. He actually calls him Son of God. Right? 237 times he calls him Lord. Just think about that for a minute. Right? And just a little side lobe here. What's the standard Trinitarian formula? One God, Father, Son, and Spirit. How come there's no Lord in there when that is by far the most important designation for Paul of Jesus? And what does he mean by this, Lord? We'll look at 1 Corinthians 8:6. That really does sound like the Shema. But for us, there is one God and Father and one Lord Jesus Christ. That really does sound like the Shema. In the same way that the scribe's question in Mark 2 echoes the Shema.
Interesting.
So I'm just, if I'm trying to work out how in the world Dan justifies introducing the one who's authorized to bear the name of Yahweh. Because that's not the language that you get in the New Testament. He's actually identified as the Lord. He doesn't bear the name, he is the Lord. So it makes me think, Dan, you're running with something else here. You've got some idea from somewhere else, but you haven't got that from reading the later New Testament's description of who Jesus is. So are you suggesting that they all got it wrong, and instead of reading Lord, we should instead have the angel of Yahweh? Or might it be that, in fact, you've got it wrong and you haven't understood what the New Testament authors are trying to say? That's another alternative. But anyway, just to pick up on that bearer of the name thing.
Interesting. We'll continue.
Why do you raise such questions in your heart? In the Hebrew Bible, only God has the ability to read the hearts of men. W.D. Davies and Dale Allison comment on this story as it's found in Matthew, and they say, Jesus did not have to hear speech in order to know people's thoughts. He could read minds. Of course, the idea that a spiritual master can communicate in ways that do not involve ordinary sensory means is common in world literature. Later on in Matthew, Jesus will again display supernatural prescience. So just as Jesus is like God in that he has the power to forgive sins, so is he like God in that he knows what people think in their hearts. So Mark and Matthew tell us Jesus had an ability that only God has.
And if you actually read the rest of Davies and Allison's commentary on Matthew, you would see that they do not interpret this as an identification of Jesus as God. Neither does Matthew. In fact, Matthew makes precisely my point for me. So if we go to Matthew 9, where we have the same story as in Mark 2, and we go to verse 8, it says, when the crowd saw it, they were filled with awe, and they glorified God, who had given such authority to human beings, specifically Jesus, who was a human being. So this is not saying Jesus is God. This is saying the things that only God was supposed to be able to do have been given to humans, specifically Jesus, but this also has to do with other human beings. In fact, that's precisely how Davies and Allison interpret it. Whereas the ending in Mark stresses the miracle, in our gospel, the emphasis comes down upon the authority given to Jesus and implicitly to his followers. So you seem to be appealing to Davies and Allison. Other humans are going to be able to do the same as well.
But Jesus also calls himself Robert Bowman Jr. and Ed Koshevsky. When Jesus constantly alludes to
Yep. Did you want to stop?
That
Sorry.
was breaking up again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's okay. It was breaking up and I couldn't. Well, I think I just want to say I think they're basically chasing a red herring here. As I've tried to argue, Jesus is not really going after identity. Right? He's really going after his authority. That doesn't mean the authority question is not going to come along in the back end of that. Just given Israel's understanding their scriptures, the scribes, that's exactly what you expect to happen at some point. But it's not an issue that Jesus pursues. And Dan seems to think that Jesus should pursue that. But actually, who gets to determine how Jesus should act, Dan or Jesus? Just read Mark and see what Jesus does. He's, as I've already mentioned several times, he wants to keep that identity thing under wraps until he's ready. Right? And that would be part of the Messianic seeker and why he does all of that, if you like. So the thing about Matthew is, I think Dan kind of skated over one of the difficulties here. I mean, he's right. There is the Matthean parallel, but it's the crowds who say this authority is given to humans. So I've got a couple of questions about this. First of all, I'm not really sure the crowds in any of the Gospels are seen as spiritual paragons of wisdom. That's just the crowd's opinion. How seriously we're meant to take their understanding, I'm not sure, right? The other thing is that it's a little odd because this authority is not given to humans. At this point, it's only given to Jesus, and it's so unusual. Look at their response. It's fear, awe, and glorifying God. Well, in Israel's scriptures, that's characteristically the response to Yahweh's presence. Right? So, I think Dan is at least picking this up when he talks about, Jesus is doing stuff that manifests who Yahweh is. The question is, on what basis is that happening? Is that happening because God has somehow delegated this to a human being, or is it the more traditional orthodox answer, not saying it's therefore right, but the more historic answer, that there's something about who Jesus is that transcends being merely human?
Mm.
And I don't know that Dan really answers that question.
Um,
I just don't think that's addressed. But I wouldn't necessarily go to this passage to argue that Jesus is trying to demonstrate that he's God. I don't think he's making claims. I would go to it and say, well, I think he does this stuff because of who he actually is. And if you take the scribe's answer, it's there's God and no one else. Well, based on that, what are you doing then with Jesus' response? Jesus might not be saying the Son of Man is a figure separate from God. He might be saying something about who he is. Right? Remember that he's not talking about Daniel, Son of Man yet.
mm.
And then I should probably add here that even Daniel 7's a bit tricky because riding on the clouds is actually what Yahweh does. Right? And everywhere
Swift cloud
else
in
in
judgment
Daniel,
of Egypt, I think.
yep, and every other place in Daniel, you get the Aramaic palach, right? That serve language is always used of Yahweh.
Okay,
It's the
that's a good
appropriate
question.
response.
I get into a lot of debates
Yeah.
with Jehovah's Witness, and they talk
Yeah.
about that. Is Pelach, just on a side topic, is that indicative of worship or service?
Well, I think it really depends on the context. So if you go back and look at we're talking about Greek, so go have a look at the Greek use of latrueo, right? You get this early on in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and it's clearly worship of Yahweh. He stands at the center. And of course, serving Yahweh means to worship him. That's pretty clear. In Daniel, its use is over against the idols, and that's even more heightened in the book of Daniel. They
Yep.
will not worship the idols.
Yeah.
So the Daniel 7 reference is the only reference to a human figure. Only reference to a human figure in terms of this language. So what do you do with it, right? When the whole background of the use of that verb really is about appropriate worship of Yahweh.
Yeah.
Is this kind of the exception that proves the rule, or are we getting some hints about whoever this figure is in Daniel 7, and it is poetic, it's visionary, it's not trying to be precise, like Pauline letters, unpacking all this stuff. Are we getting some hints as to who this figure might actually be when they come? Are we seeing crossings of the traditional Jewish boundaries? Right back in Genesis 1, there's the creator and everything else, and you never cross that line. That's what the scribes are arguing for. But are there some hints going on where there seems to be the suggestion that what's going to come is in fact going to be outside of people's normal expectation?
Well, I think I remember
I don't
seeing
think
quite a
that's
few. I remember seeing quite a few lectures from Dr. Michael Hires. I ended up buying Alan Segal's book, Two Powers in Heaven, and there was this discussion about Genesis 19:24, Exodus 15:3, and Daniel 7:13 to 14. That there seems to be very difficult to reconcile this other figure within a monotheistic presupposition, because it's clearly this second but divine power. So it's not necessarily. It was difficult to articulate. It seemed like for 300 years it took that amount of time potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, to articulate the nature of Jesus within that monotheistic framework as well. So from a church dogmatic perspective,
I don't know that it's there for Mark.
Say that again.
So I don't think it's an issue for the New Testament.
Yeah.
I don't think it's an issue for the New Testament. I mean, it's the post-apostolic church, and this is going to be a little more, controversial, but they're the ones who really try to make sense of Jesus in the Greek ontological framework. But who says that Plato and Aristotle are correct? But the New Testament never fusses about this. Right? And maybe all those big debates about Jesus being fully human and fully God, they're really only problems if you accept Greek ontological categories. It doesn't seem to be an issue for the writers of the New Testament. They don't seem to have a problem presenting Jesus as fully human, and then Paul calling him Lord over 230 times, which, on the surface of things means Yahweh.
Fascinating.
It's a later problem. It's not one for the New Testament.
Yeah, I don't know. Give me more questions. This is going on the list. Okay. Fascinating. I like that. And it's not, is it? Ultimately, okay. Ultimately, it's not the way you read the way that you read Paul, the way you read Mark and Luke, and it's not an issue in that regard, is it? And it's not necessarily their
No.
objective. They're reporting the facts as they see it.
So just to come
Fascinating.
back to that, I think the question that's really being asked, and Dan is picking up on, and he's gone to one side of this equation, is given that there is a link in Israel's history between what you do and say and who you are, given that that's there, and then given the traditional Jewish view that as represented by the scribes, right, that only Yahweh can do and say these kinds of things. Anything else is blasphemy. The question is, does Jesus do this because God has granted him that authority, right? Or because he is somehow, his identity is somehow connected with Yahweh himself? Right? That's the question. And I don't think Dan takes seriously the other alternative. Right? And then when I hear that really strong, censorious language, completely illogical, I'm thinking, okay, this doesn't sound like a guy who's been willing to give the other side a fair hearing. But I then say to Dan, you want to talk about these figures like the angel of the Lord, and you want to talk about the Son of Man. But as far as I can see, and I've done my own work on this, I know of no mediatorial figure in Israel's first century expectation that ever forgives sins. And I could cite you the text if you wanted to go through them, but right, it's sometimes claimed the Messiah forgives sins, but actually he doesn't. In the Targum, he actually intercedes on behalf
What's
of
that
Israel's
scripture in
sins.
Isaiah?
Anyway,
What's that scripture in Isaiah about that angel I sent before you? Don't upset him; he will not forgive you.
you referring to Exodus?
Is it
23?
Exodus? He goes, he bears my
Yeah,
presence, my fate, my name is in
23,
him. He will not
21.
forgive. Do
Yep,
not
yep.
transgress him. He will not forgive your sins.
So I think the assumption underlying that is that this angel can,
Yes,
right?
not that he
But what
doesn't.
if that's not what that means? If that language means it's simply not within his power to forgive, or that's not actually his task to forgive.
Okay.
So it's interesting that
Either way, it doesn't
when you,
happen.
yeah, but if you read Malachi, it also uses this Adon language. And you've got the messenger who comes, who precedes the Lord, right? Well, that would fit with the Jewish expectation. You want some Elijah figure for the coming of not an intermediary, but Yahweh himself. But at the end of Malachi, it's pretty clear if you don't respond to the angel that's spoken of in Malachi, there's no forgiveness, it's judgment. And I think that's what John the Baptist is saying in the opening of Mark, right? This judgment's coming. I can't stop it. There's nothing I can do now to intercede for you. It's been determined. If you don't listen, you will be judged.
Yeah.
And you see that with Jeremiah, where God says to Jeremiah, it's true, in the past I listened to Moses and I forgave you, but this time I will not relent, even if, Samuel or Moses stood before me. So that language of, the angel will not forgive, I'm not sure that you can immediately read into that this angel of Yahweh can, if he wants to, forgive.
Sure.
I think that's reading an awful lot into one phrase.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to argue with you.
Oh, okay. I'm just responding to Dan on this one. I think it's an awful lot, a lot of weight to put on one, phrase there.
And Rick, I'm not sure what your time frame is because we've only got essentially halfway through the video. But if you need to pull up stumps here and we can come back and do a second episode, I'm more than happy. I'll just happy to proceed on the basis that you have the
I think you
time
might have
allowed.
to because family's home, and I think if that's okay, if you can,
Yeah.
more than happy to come back. But
Lovely.
I think they're expecting me to finish in about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, well, what we'll do is we can pause it there. That's fine. And really appreciate the time you've afforded. And we can continue this because I think there's so much to digest out of this and what you've provided for us today. A lot to think about, a lot of food for thought. And we can essentially take it up as a part two. First off, Thank you so much for having the time to do this. This is fantastic. I think your perspective on things is highly. I think it's very fair. I think you're being very fair to both parties with regards to this, because there's so much. I mean, their initial engagement is the idea of Jesus. Did Jesus claim to be God? And they've really focused on Mark 2. And I think you present a lot of interesting information with regards to how we should look at the text, and how whether there's a need to argue between authority and identity, and what necessarily can infer regardless, and what it doesn't. So I think you've presented a really interesting take on this, and I think it's going to be quite fruitful for people to analyze, especially when they come into the text, with a potentially a religious mindset and a dogmatic mindset. And it's interesting how the people that accuse other people of being dogmatic seem to be somewhat dogmatic themselves.
And can I just add to that? As I mentioned earlier, in some ways, it's not. I don't mean to sound patronising. It's not Dan and Mike's fault in one sense, because the way our situation is set up, we have to choose New Testament or what we call the Old Testament. Interestingly, that's language that neither Jesus nor anyone who knew him best ever used. So why do we speak of this as the Old Testament? No, I think we're much better calling them Israel's scriptures. And according to Jesus in John, they cannot be annulled. Okay. Well, the problem is mostly we're not grounded in Israel's history. Right? Very few of us could actually give an extended talk about what's going on in the Exodus. Right? It's just, right? Or, Isaiah, the great hope of a new Exodus. We talked about how prominent that was. How many of us New Testament guys could sit down and talk for an hour and a half on what's going on in Isaiah? Right? So, to be kind, it's not our fault, but in some ways we're talking about what we don't know. We just don't understand this stuff. Jesus is Jewish. That fact got lost, I think, for nearly 1,700 years in the church's history. Never really taken seriously. Well, that's all been regained, I think, in the last, 75 years or so, thereabouts. So you've got to know Israel's scriptures. You've got to be deeply embedded in those.
Look, again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and I look forward to making another time. Would you like to come back and we could do part 2?
Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
Love to talk about all of these things. Very happy to do it.
That's great. I think that people are really going to enjoy it. So again, thank you very much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Take care.
And thank you for your patience. Very kind.